No way she survives out there. That was all anyone said when they saw a small female medic step into the SEAL formation. Too frail, too quiet, too ordinary to march beside the most elite warriors in America. But then, in a scorched Texas valley, when the gunfire erupted, when men once thought unbreakable fell bleeding into the dust, she did not run. She charged straight into the storm of bullets. And in the very moment when everyone believed it was over, she pulled all three of them back from the hands of death. Her name was Sergeant Leah Morgan. A woman with brown hair always tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her slender frame looked as if the wind could carry her away, yet anyone who looked closely would notice in her stride a steady weight, a resilience not easily shaken. She arrived at the SEAL base in Coronado, California on a sun-drenched morning where beach sand still clung to the sailors' boots, and from that very moment, Leah became the subject of conversation. No one there was accustomed to the presence of someone like her. Hardened, sunburned men who lived with the cold steel of Barrett rifles, who thought nothing of 30-mile night marches, who measured days by gunpowder and blood, now suddenly had to share space with a frail woman who carried the title of medic. To them it seemed absurd, like sending a veterinarian onto a NASCAR track. The whispers spread quickly, passed around with half smiles and mocking grins. Medics belong in the infirmary, not the front line. Another rifle would have been more useful. Sometimes those jokes burst into raucous laughter, the kind that sounded like beer cans popping open on the training field. Not truly malicious, but sharp enough to carve an invisible line. Leah was an outsider, and they wanted her to know it. Yet Leah never reacted. Not once did she snap back, not once did she show offense. She simply tightened the strap of her medic's bag, the strap that had carved calluses into her shoulder after years in the field, and went on with her work. That very first morning, while the SEALs adjusted rifle stocks or retied bootlaces, Leah crouched beside her medical pack, opening each compartment, checking everything with meticulous care, bandages counted, tourniquets rolled tight, syringes lined up like instruments in an orchestra waiting for the conductor's cue. If anyone had paid attention, they would have seen how her fingers moved quick, yet never rushed, like the hands of a musician who knew her instrument by heart. What others dismissed as cluttered medical gear, Leah handled like weapons sharpened for battle, silent, precise, deadly in their own way. Now and then, her eyes flicked around, not to return scorn, but to memorize the smallest details. A loose strap on body armor, a canteen drained too quickly, a shoulder favoring the left side, little things her teammates ignored. They saw her as misplaced. But in her steady gaze, Leah was already reading more than they imagined. Coronado was not kind to newcomers, least of all a female medic. The training ground reeked of sweat, laced with sea salt. The thud of boots on concrete pounded like a war drum. Around her, men loomed like slabs of iron, arms corded with muscle, shoulders broad as walls. They moved in formation, joked aloud, carried themselves with the swagger of those convinced nothing could break them. In their midst, Leah was a dot of stillness in the storm. And strangely, she never flinched. Anyone else might have tried to prove themselves with loud words or by mimicking the men's brutal workouts. Leah chose silence instead, but it was not the silence of fear. It was a different kind, one that unsettled people because it came from a quiet confidence, as if she knew something they didn't. During brief pauses, a few men watched her on the sly. To them, Leah looked more like a suburban nurse than a soldier preparing for combat. Her uniform didn't stretch tight over bulging muscles. It fit neatly over a compact frame. But look closer, and you would see the firm line of her shoulders, sinewy arms not built in modern gyms, but carved by years of lifting patients, by trudging through forests and rivers with a medic's pack heavy as stone. Others didn't realize it, but Leah knew the value of every single item she carried, every roll of gauze, every syringe. Each instrument could mean the difference between life and death. And more than anyone, she understood. Her job was not to be liked, but to be ready. her ready for the moment when everyone else would be overwhelmed. Amid the laughter, sometimes clumsy, sometimes cruel, no one saw the truth, that the small woman they joked about might one day be the only one standing between them and death. They saw a medic. She saw potential patients she would never allow to be lost. That afternoon, when the sunlight poured gold across Coronado, Leah sat alone on the barracks steps, polishing her scalpel and rearranging her kit. Around her, the raucous laughter of teammates echoed like waves crashing on the beach. She didn't join them, didn't walk away either. She simply sat there, quiet but unyielding like a piece of steel no storm could erode, a piece that refused to blend in yet fit exactly where it needed to be. At Coronado, people only knew Leah Morgan as a medic who had fallen out of the sky, an exception assigned to a place reserved for men who trusted only in their biceps and their Barrett rifles. But no one truly knew her past. There were no files gleaming with medals, no barroom tales of heroic feats retold into legend. The only thing that existed was a fragment of memory that clung to Leah like a shadow that would never fade. Years earlier, when Hurricane Katrina swallowed the Louisiana coast, Leah had been nothing more than a volunteer nurse, not yet in uniform. The images of those days were seared into her mind. Water rising to engulf the city, rooftops turning into islands, cries for help mingling with the relentless wail of rescue sirens. Leah and her volunteer team set up a field hospital in the yard of an abandoned high school. There was no air conditioning, no proper beds, only the musty stench of rotting wood and the weak glow of flashlights. There, she witnessed the cruelest truth. Patients waiting too long, their bodies cooling as rescue forces failed to arrive in time. Leah had once spent an entire night holding the frail, bony hand of an old woman just so she wouldn't die alone. She remembered vividly the wide eyes of a little boy clutching a soaked teddy bear, sitting beside his mother who no longer breathed. Those memories were not stories one tells to earn points. But from the wreckage of Katrina, something within her changed forever. Leah swore she would never again stand by and watch someone die simply because help didn't come in time. Rumor had it that after that disaster, she always carried a small object. A silver band of metal, its edges worn, engraved with words as cold as they were fierce. 0 casualty is acceptable. No one knew who had carved it for her. Perhaps an old colleague, perhaps Leah herself, her hands trembling as she turned a vow into something tangible. But anyone who saw it swaying from her medic bag understood. It wasn't jewelry. It was a declaration. At Coronado, however, that detail only made her more of an outlier. The SEALs would joke, with a lucky charm like that, guess she doesn't even need a gun. Others scoffed, saying the words sounded good but had no place in reality. War was a place where casualties were inevitable. What difference could a medic make? Leah didn't argue. Sometimes she would simply brush her thumb against the silver band, as if reminding herself of that night in Louisiana when cries for help were swallowed by the floodwaters. To her, those words were not a delusion, but the only milestone that marked her path. Once, while she was inspecting her gear, a young teammate casually asked, "Why do you check every single thing, over and over? Who does it 3 times?" Leah only smiled, without answering. He couldn't understand, but Leah did. In that makeshift hospital, one missing roll of gauze could mean the loss of a life. That memory, like an invisible scar, would never heal. At times, during breaks, Leah would sit at the edge of the yard, her eyes drifting toward the endless blue of the Pacific. Others thought she was daydreaming, but in truth, her mind returned to images of thousands of rooftops submerged beneath a sea of water. Those fragments of memory never left her. They became fuel, transforming a slender nurse into a medic who refused to yield. Ironically, it was that silence of hers that sometimes unsettled the men. A few seasoned SEALs muttered, "Something's not right with her. Who works like tomorrow's the end of the world?" Others grew curious. Did she go through something we can't even imagine? The truth was, yes. But Leah never needed their belief. She knew trust only arrived in chaos, when theory and prejudice both collapsed. In those moments, one question alone would remain: who is the one who will not abandon their teammates? Perhaps that silver band was never meant to be a mere trinket hanging from her pack. Perhaps it was a moving reminder that sometimes it only takes one person willing to defy convention to rewrite the ending. And so, beneath the harsh sun of Coronado, Leah carried on with her quiet ritual, checking, memorizing, preparing as if Katrina might return without warning. Around her, the laughter continued, but beneath that laughter, cracks had begun to form, because they knew deep down some stories never needed to be spoken. They lived in her gaze, in the hardened calluses of her shoulder, and in a weathered silver band that swayed silently at her side. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. Texas at noon was not just hot, it was searing. The sun poured down into the border valley, a harsh, blinding white light, turning slabs of rock into open furnaces, while the air hung heavy, suffocating, like a wet blanket pressed against the chest. The SEAL team moved in staggered formation along the ridge, boots crunching over gravel, every pair of eyes sweeping cracks and shadows. No one spoke. The silence was broken only by the scrape of stone underfoot and the steady rasp of breath dragged through parched throats. In the middle of the line, Leah Morgan moved like a shadow, the weight of her medic's bag pressing into her shoulders. Unlike her teammates, she wasn't scanning for movement along the ridges. What she watched were the smallest details, sometimes so small even their owners didn't notice. The way Kowalski drained his canteen in less than 3 minutes. The unnatural flush spreading across his face. The ragged, sprint-like gasps even though the team's pace remained steady. Without a word, Leah pulled an electrolyte packet from her pocket and held it out. Kowalski shot her a glance, smirk curling with disdain, as if insulted by the thought that he, a seasoned SEAL, needed the same lemon-flavored powder marathon runners used. He shook his head and pushed ahead, boots slamming into the ground harder than necessary. But 10 minutes later, when his stride faltered, it was Leah who caught him and eased him down before his body collapsed under heat shock. Captain Ramirez, cold as steel, cut his gaze toward her. His eyes carried no praise, yet the flicker within them was enough for Leah to know he understood. He didn't speak, and she didn't need him to. In the military, sometimes silence is the clearest recognition of all. The march continued. The ground sloped downward, layers of dirt breaking loose and rolling like marbles, demanding perfect balance with every step. Leah's gaze caught Santos, the youngest of the team, gripping his rifle strap too tightly, veins standing out not from strain but from nerves. On Ramirez's shoulder, the radio crackled in static bursts, the sound like metal scratching the inside of the ear. Leah noted it all, as if reading a book written in a language only she understood. Not everyone appreciated it. Danner, the one who always grinned when tension rose, tilted his chin toward Leah and whispered to Kowalski, "Our doc's babysitting again, like a kindergarten teacher." Both men chuckled, their laughter swallowed quickly by the scorching wind, yet still loud enough for Leah to hear. She didn't react. She was used to it at Coronado. The laughter had been as common as grains of sand. Instead of answering back, she logged another detail, the way Kowalski's left foot avoided sharp stones, a telltale sign of an old injury not yet healed. To the SEALs, such things were no big deal. To Leah, they were warnings. The atmosphere grew heavier, not just from the heat, but from Leah's presence, an element the team still didn't know how to place. Was she a medic? Dead weight? Or an unsettling mirror reflecting flaws they preferred to ignore? It was her silence that unnerved them most. Because when you're used to being the strongest in the room, no one likes the quiet one who sees weakness, even if she never says it aloud. Ramirez looked at her again. He had lived long enough in battle to know excessive calm in a place like this was not naivety. It was experience. He didn't know what she had endured before arriving here, but the way she spotted things, skin tone, breath rhythm, the angle of a shoulder made him wonder. Perhaps behind that small frame lay something even his hardened seals hadn't yet grasped. The sun climbed higher, its rays like knives slashing down. The valley glared white, shadows thinning to nothing. They reached the dry riverbed, a stretch of pale gravel, stark as a scar cut into the earth. To seals it was textbook. A dried-out riverbed flanked by steep cliffs was nothing less than a funnel-perfect ground for an ambush. Leah recognized it too, not from tactical training, but from memory. Katrina surged back in her mind. That feeling when you stand in a place that seems safe, and then, without warning, a flood crashes in from nowhere. This valley was the same, empty, too quiet, and ominous in its stillness. When Ramirez raised his fist, the team dropped low, eyes scouring the ridges. Silence. Nothing but cicadas buzzing, and heat shimmering upward from stone. But Leah's eyes caught what others missed. A brief glint of metal on the slope, a rock out of place, and most telling of all, the tension coiled in Ramirez's shoulders, though he feigned calm. She said nothing. This was not the time for a medic to deliver tactical warnings. But deep inside, Leah knew. The silence of nature was often the loudest drumbeat of the storm to come. The first sound struck like a slap across the air, a gunshot cracking sharp and violent, tearing through silence already strung tight as wire. No one had time to react before the telltale shriek of an RPG came slicing down from the hillside, dragging behind it a white trail of smoke like a giant serpent weaving across the sky. The explosion shattered the stone floor. Dust erupted in choking clouds. Shards flew like metallic rain, embedding into anything in their path. The formation that had been tight and disciplined broke instantly. Men dove left and right, combat instinct forcing every muscle to scramble for cover, whether it was a shallow crack in the rock or a jagged boulder barely big enough to shield half a body. In that chaos, 3 figures went down. Kowalski clutched his thigh, blood spurting in hard, rhythmic bursts, staining the pale gravel beneath him crimson. Danner, the one always grinning wide, now lay on his back, chest punctured, his breath rasping in short, broken gasps, like air being dragged through a torn bellows. Santos, the youngest, had his arm ripped open by shrapnel, blood spraying in dark streams that mixed with the blistering dust. The field medicine manual, Leah knew by heart. When casualties strike, you triage. Save those with the highest chance of survival first, leave the rest behind, because one man can mean the difference between the survival of many. But Leah, at the very moment she saw 3 of her brothers bleeding out on the rocks, knew she would never do that. In her mind, Katrina came roaring back, the faces left behind, the ones lost because help never came in time. And this time, she would not let history repeat itself. Leah hurled herself forward. No orders. No calculations. Bullets sliced past her head, each one whispering like a blade skimming the ear. She hit the ground flat, crawling, dragging the medic's bag behind her, its straps rasping loud against the gravel. Her sleeves tore, rocks scraped her arms raw, but she never stopped. Kowalski was first. His face was already ashen, lips trembling as if cursing, but no sound came. Leah didn't waste a second. She ripped out a tourniquet, looped it high on his thigh, twisted until a scream ripped from him, and the blood stopped spraying. No time for comfort. She rolled, dragging herself to Danner. He was still conscious, coughing up thick ropes of dark blood. The sound was as cold as bent metal snapping. Leah tore open a chest seal, pressed it hard over the wound, her hand locked in place, as if letting go for even a second would let his life escape. She leaned close, voice steady enough to anchor him even through the chaos. "Stay with me." You're going to be all right. And impossibly, despite the bullets screaming overhead, that single sentence dimmed the panic in Danner's eyes. Santos lay farther off, one arm barely intact, his uniform soaked in spreading red. Leah crawled through falling debris as a burst of rounds tore into the rock above, sending stone fragments raining down like splinters. Still, she pushed on. Gauze pressed, bandage wound tight, blood flow slowed beneath her grip. In just minutes, 3 men that the textbook might have written off Leah had wrestled each of them back from the edge. The team kept firing, but every eye flicked toward her. The small woman, the one they had mocked, now lay exposed in open fire, doing the unthinkable, refusing to leave anyone behind. And strangely, that sight alone made them shoot harder, fiercer, throwing steel and fire to cover her. Deep down, they knew she was fighting for them in a way their rifles never could. In the middle of the firefight, Leah thought briefly of the joke from a few days before. Medics belong in the clinic, not on the front lines. If she had the breath to laugh, she would have. Because the clinic today was nothing more than this riverbed of blood and gunpowder, and her patients were men who once looked invincible. Sometimes life had its own twisted humor, except here it used live rounds instead of laughter. Sweat mixed with blood stinging her eyes. Leah blinked hard, again and again, but her hands never faltered. As she bandaged, she counted silently pulse beats, breaths, seconds passing. This was no longer just first aid, it was a race against death itself. Every heartbeat a tick on the clock. Bullets still cracked. Screams still echoed. But inside Leah's focus, the world had narrowed to 3 fragile lives, gasping in the dirt. And she knew, in that moment, she wasn't merely a medic. She was the line between life and death, the only reason hope had not yet been extinguished in that burning valley. Amid the gunfire hammering against the cliff walls, Leah knew bandages alone would never be enough. If they stayed there, sprawled in the open riverbed, every tourniquet, every pressure wrap, every hemostatic dressing would buy only a few more agonizing minutes, not life. She had to move them. And that was the most reckless decision imaginable. The kind anyone watching would dismiss with a shake of the head. A woman weighing barely 130 pounds, carrying a medic's bag heavy as half her body. Now planning to drag full-grown seals, each 100 pounds heavier, straight across a battlefield exploding with fire. She began with Kowalski. He was as heavy as a boulder, his blood-soaked vest slick in her grip. Leah wrapped her arms beneath his armpits and pulled inch by inch, his boots scraping grooves through the searing gravel. Every yard won was its own private war. A bullet slammed into the ground inches from her hip, shards of rock ripped through her pant leg. But Leah never let go. Every breath was a strain that felt like lifting the earth itself, and every burst of machine gun fire overhead only drove her harder forward. At last, she dragged him into a shallow depression in the earth, not safe, but safer. Without pausing, Leah lunged for Danner. Wide in panic, chest wound heaving under blood-soaked dressings, every breath a gamble. Moving him was perilous, too much jarring could collapse his lung completely. Leah knew it. But she also knew leaving him in the open riverbed was a death sentence faster than any injury. She lowered herself, gripped the straps of his vest, and hauled him carefully, deliberately, guided by the instinct of someone who had carried dozens of patients on improvised stretchers back during Katrina. Bullets cracked behind her, shards stung her face, but still she steadied his head, shielded his chest, moved him without letting his breathing spiral out of control. For a fleeting moment she thought, if he were conscious enough, he'd probably be cursing her for violating patient transport protocol. But right now, that was the only broken protocol that could save him. Santos was last. The blast had hurled him aside, his blood still seeping stubbornly past the pressure bandage. He was young, his face stamped with disbelief, as though he still couldn't accept this was real. Leah grabbed the sling of his rifle across his chest and dragged him in jerks, one wrenching pull at a time. The weight pressed fire into her back, pain stabbing as if her spine might splinter. Sweat streamed into her mouth, tasting bitter and raw. Bullets ripped past her ears like monstrous bees, the sound enough to make anyone duck for cover. Instead, Leah barked a hoarse laugh through clenched teeth. "If you survive this, I'm suing you for being over-regulation weight." The muttered line was just to keep herself conscious, a sliver of dark humor to stop her heart from breaking stride. When all three men were finally dragged into the depression, Leah allowed herself exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to shake, to gasp as if her lungs were burning, to recognize that she had just done what none of the men around her, least of all the three she had saved, ever believed she could do. But 10 seconds was all. Then she pushed herself upright, checking pulses, tightening dressings, dripping the last of her water onto their cracked lips. The other soldiers, crouched behind rocks, kept firing but couldn't stop glancing back at her. They no longer needed convincing. In a single string of actions, Leah had demolished every boundary. She was no longer the medic they mocked, no longer the outsider the team was forced to carry. She was the only reason three teammates were still breathing in the storm of fire. And somehow her small but relentless presence drove them to pull triggers harder, faster, fiercer, like they owed her a wall of bullets in return. Leah never thought of honor, never thought of recognition. In her mind there was only one principle: no one gets left behind. The words became the axis of her every move, turning pain and exhaustion into fuel. On that battlefield she was no longer the Katrina nurse, no longer the Coronado medic. She was the living embodiment of the vow etched into a worn piece of silver. The valley shook with explosions, but in the hollow where Leah knelt, there was another kind of silence, the silence of three lives pulled back from the hands of death. At first, the mocking laughter still echoed in memory, the half-joking, half-serious remarks that a medic belonged in the clinic, that another rifle would be more useful. But in the moment Leah crawled face down through the storm of bullets, those laughs vanished. In eyes that were trained to see comrades only through the crosshairs, the SEALs witnessed something they had never imagined: a small woman exposing herself to fire, dragging three massive warriors out of death's reach without hesitation, without calculation. Ramirez, whose face had always been cold as steel, was the first to change. His voice thundered through the radio, striking the cliffs like a hammer. "Suppressive fire! Keep their heads down!" And instantly the team responded. No more token bursts, but a wall of gunfire pouring down on every enemy nest along the ridge. Fingers clenched their triggers with new fury, because they understood that now not just their lives, but their honor itself was in Leah's hands. Everyone still standing, everyone still holding a weapon, threw everything into protecting her. Not one SEAL saw Leah as a burden anymore. On the contrary, they fought for her, for the one who had dared to do what none of them could, or dared to do. Amid the frantic heartbeat of the battle, an unspoken truth spread among them. Leah was no longer the medic, she was a teammate. Then came the roar, the familiar chopping thunder of helicopter blades slicing the air. The entire valley seemed to tremble as a Black Hawk skimmed low, dust billowing in suffocating clouds. Its door guns spat fiery streaks down onto the rocks, pounding like thunder. The enemy faltered, ducking back into cracks in the hillside. That fleeting moment was enough for Leah to continue. She didn't stop. Her legs shook with exhaustion, her hands felt numb, as if turned to rubber, yet she clung to the straps of each man, dragging them closer to the waiting helicopter. When the crew rushed out to help, she wasn't only shoving her teammates onto stretchers, she was reporting every detail of their wounds with a voice steady as stone. Left thigh, tourniquet in place, major blood loss but stabilized. Chest wound, sealed dressing, needs immediate surgery. Right arm destroyed, pressure bandage applied, monitor for shock. Her tone was unnervingly calm, almost clinical, not quivering even under the roar of engines. And it was that composure that stunned the crew. Most medics would panic in chaos like this. Leah, however, delivered her report like reading from a manual, but her eyes blazed with relentless resolve. Ramirez stood beside her, sand whipping his face raw, staring at Leah as though seeing something he had never believed in. Through his career, he had witnessed extraordinary scenes, but this was different. Leah hadn't felled a single enemy, hadn't led a charge, yet through sheer refusal to quit, she had done what no one else in the squad could. She had turned certain defeat into a chance at survival. In the dust-filled moment, Ramirez pulled the worn patch from his vest. The sealed trident, stained with sweat and age, he pressed it into Leah's hand. No ceremony, no flourish, just 4 words, "You've earned this." It was more than a gesture. For any seal, the trident is not cloth and thread, it is history, it is blood, it is the pledge that the bearer has been accepted into the most closed circle, where trust is built on lives. And now, a medic the one once ridiculed, dismissed was given it, in the middle of battle, before every witness. In their eyes, contempt had disappeared. In its place was respect too deep for words. Leah hadn't asked, hadn't demanded. She had simply lived her conviction, and that alone forced the proudest warriors to bow their heads in recognition. The helicopter lifted, tilting away from the scarred riverbed, the dust rising like a curtain to conceal the scene. But in the memory of everyone there, one image would never fade. The slight frame of Leah Morgan, quiet but unyielding, the reason 3 SEALs still drew breath on the stretcher. And from that moment on, no one ever dared call her an outsider again. The official report after that battle was so dry it bordered on heartless. 3 wounded soldiers were successfully evacuated, returned to duty after 6 weeks. No detail about the storm of bullets. No mention of the desperate crawl across the riverbed, and not a single word about Leah Morgan. In those cold lines, it was as if the event had never truly happened, or if it had, it was reduced to nothing more than another statistic buried among thousands of missions. But out there, in the SEAL halls, in the makeshift tents of forward bases, the story spread in whispers, then grew into a chorus. The tale of a small medic who refused to abandon her comrades, who dragged 3 massive men out of the El Paso riverbed, while the sky itself poured fire upon them. Those who had witnessed it did not tell it with exaggeration, but with solemn eyes, for there are things greater than words, and Leah had touched that place. The silver tag dangling from her medic bag, the one etched with the words, "Zero casualty is acceptable," once a private vow, had now passed beyond the personal. It became legend. In boot camp sessions, commanders invoked it as a warning that strength is not only in muscle or firepower, but in the courage that refuses to accept loss. Around campfires at night, as beer cans were passed from hand to hand, the men spoke of the medic of El Paso with half smiles, half reverence. No one needed to name her, because when the story was told, everyone knew it meant Leah. The strange thing was that Leah herself never sought recognition. Back at base, she quietly cleaned her scalpels, checked her bandages, rearranged her medic bag. She was silent, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just witnessed a miracle. But that silence, to her teammates, no longer felt like distance. It became proof of something rare, a strength that does not demand acknowledgement, yet is acknowledged all the same. Kowalski, once recovered, carried a limp he jokingly called Leah's mark. Danner, with the scar stretching across his chest, boasted that the ladies love it, a bit of humor to turn pain into pride. Santos learned to shoot left-handed, and whenever anyone asked, he would grin and say, "Trust me, I'm better now." Yet deep inside, all 3 knew they were alive to tell those jokes only because of Leah. Ramirez, the man who had once spoken no more than necessary, now, whenever a new recruit asked about the meaning of the trident patch, would slowly recount the story of El Paso. He never used words like hero or miracle. He would simply say, "Sometimes the only difference between life and death is one person refusing to quit." And then he would leave the rookies to think on it themselves. The image of Leah, sitting alone under the Coronado sun, polishing her instruments, no longer evoked isolation. It evoked the woman who had redefined what it meant to be a teammate. She was not a SEAL in the traditional sense. She needed no bulging muscles or kill counts. But she had proven that courage wears many shapes, and sometimes the smallest frame carries the greatest weight. On certain nights, when the Pacific breeze drifted across the base, Leah would unconsciously reach for the silver tag. It was more scratched now, its edges worn, yet the words were still clear. 0 casualty is acceptable. It was no longer just her personal oath. It was a flame passed on to the team, then to the wider brotherhood, a flame no official report, no bureaucratic silence could ever extinguish. And so, one day, when a young soldier arrives, swaggering with the belief that strength is everything, someone will lean in and tell him, once, there was a small medic who saved 3 SEALs in El Paso. She didn't quit, so they lived to tell the tale. And that story will be told again and again, like a legend that never grows old. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. No, history cannot be allowed to repeat itself again. Claire clenched her fists until blood surfaced when she heard the news that the young convoy was losing its way in the Mojave sandstorm. 20 years earlier in Iraq, she had once clung to a charred map to lead her teammates to survival through the hell of Fallujah. Now, inside the brightly lit training room, she was still dismissed as an old librarian, but the howling wind outside had called her back, and that map had never stopped pointing the way. The first explosion tore through the night like a bolt of lightning. Flames erupted, swallowing the scarred suburban road outside Baghdad. The Task Force 121 convoy shook violently as the IED buried beneath the dry sand detonated. Smoke, fire, and sand mixed together, forming a suffocating fog that swallowed the sky. The familiar sound of the radio suddenly went silent, the last crackle vanishing like a strangled breath. The GPS on the dashboard flickered once, then died, leaving only a black screen. The entire navigation system vanished, as if the sky itself had been erased. In the chaos, Claire Donovan, the team's SEAL navigator, felt her body hurled backward by the shock wave. Her ears rang, her eyes burned, but she forced herself upright. The Humvees ahead were twisted into burning wreckage, flames roaring like colossal torches. Her teammates, some lying motionless in the sand and smoke, others staggering upright with panicked eyes turned toward her. Time collapsed into heavy heartbeats, each second a razor's edge between life and death. Her hand shot to her pocket, where a crumpled sheet of paper had been folded countless times. It was the paper map she carried out of habit. No one still believed in paper in the digital age, but Claire had never dared to let it go. Now, it was the only thing left. The map's edges had been scorched by the blast, corners burned, ashes drifting into the night wind, but the faded ink lines and rough symbols remained. In that moment, the ragged sheet became the fragile lifeline tying the team to survival. Claire pressed the map against her chest, the heat of the cinders still searing her skin. Her breath came hard, but her eyes steadied. Amid the panic, she felt every gaze fixed on her. She didn't shout, didn't falter. She simply raised her hand, signaling with the instinct of someone who had read maps, not only with her eyes but with her memory and gut. That night, Baghdad was no city. It was a labyrinth of fire and smoke. Streets once crowded now transformed into death traps. Every turn could lead to freedom, or straight into a machine gun's barrel. Claire led the team through narrow alleys, past walls pocked with bullet holes, under collapsed rooftops. She clung to fragments of memory, to the surviving markings on the burned map, matching them to the shadows of buildings and the shapes of ridgelines. To her teammates, she became a living compass. The next 48 hours stretched into an endless trial. By day, they hid in ruined houses, lying silent under warped tin roofs, listening to boots crunch over rubble outside. By night, they crawled across avenues littered with burned-out vehicles, heat still rising from the smoldering asphalt. Each step was a gamble. Claire clutched the map so tightly its edges grew damp with sweat. Her eyes refused to leave the compass north in her mind, her ears strained to distinguish wind from gunfire. Water dwindled. Rations crumbled to crumbs. On the second night, they caught rainwater from a broken drain pipe, sharing each drop. Claire still walked point, her boots sinking into dust, her spine taut as a drawn bow. 6 followed her steps, their breaths merging into one heavy rhythm. But 3 names were left behind. One teammate fell crossing an open street, cut down by a sniper's round. Another was torn apart by a roadside mine. The last bled out in the darkness, slipping away as the rest watched helplessly. Claire never forgot their eyes. Not accusing, not afraid, only a silent nod, a message etched into her soul. Bring the others home. That nod became the weight that refused to let her collapse. The charred map was more than a tool. It was a witness, reminding her that every choice she made determined who lived. Finally, when the third dawn broke, they staggered out of the desert's edge. 6 remained, bloodied and burned, but breathing. There was no celebration, only a quiet recognition among them they had endured something beyond imagination. The official report was clinical, detached. Unit missing reappeared safe, cold, indifferent, as if those 48 hours had been nothing more than a footnote. But to Claire, every moment still echoed. The hiss of bullets tearing the air, the stench of smoke clogging her lungs, and above all the feel of that paper map pressed against her chest, hot, fragile, yet unyielding. It had never promised to save them, it only gave them a direction. And sometimes a single direction was enough to choose life over death. A heavy metal door slammed shut, sending a metallic clang echoing through the concrete hallway. Outside, the Mojave sun burned like a giant furnace, scorching the golden horizon. Inside the logistics room, everything felt inverted. Cold fluorescent light, air thick with the smell of old paper, dust, and machine oil. At the far end of shelves stacked with documents, Claire Donovan sat hunched over a desk. Her once rich brown hair, now streaked with gray, was tied neatly into a low knot. A faded gray shirt clung to her lean but sturdy frame, a body forged through years of field training. Calloused hands turned page after page, her eyes locked on the slanted numbers as though she were hunting for secrets hidden in the ink. For her, this precision wasn't just an administrative habit. It was the survival instinct that had followed her back from Fallujah. In the corner, a few young soldiers fiddled with a toolbox. Their whispers spilled into muffled laughter. I heard she used to be a SEAL. A real one? Come on, she looks more like a school librarian. At best, she organizes the ammo crates. The laughter spread across the room, sharp against Claire's ears. But she didn't lift her head. The red pen kept moving down the columns, steady and deliberate. Just as she once kept her calm in smoke-filled alleys, now she anchored herself with numbers, refusing to let her mind drift back to Fallujah. On her left leg, a scar stretched from knee to ankle, still throbbing when the weather turned. It was the legacy of a roadside mine, the blast that ended her combat career and tethered her to this desk. To the young soldiers, that scar marked old age. To Claire, it was a reminder. War could take almost everything, but it could never erase the memory of navigation. Sometimes, when her gaze drifted to the wall where a burned map hung framed in glass, a pang pierced her chest. The paper edges charred black, the ink lines smeared, the signature still etched across. It was no longer a tool, but a witness, and that witness stared back at her daily, as if to ask, "Do you still remember why you survived?" At noon, when the young soldiers poured into the mess hall, silence reclaimed the room. Claire pushed back her chair and stood, stretching until her spine cracked. A small reminder that age spares no one, not even former SEALs. She let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle before moving to the shelves, straightening the crooked files. In that moment, if a stranger walked in, they would see nothing more than a meticulous desk worker, a librarian in uniform. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lived a woman who had once led her team through hell. Even now, in dreams, she still walked the alleys of Baghdad, still heard gunfire falling like rain, still felt the searing heat of a map pressed to her chest. And each morning when she woke, she faced the blinding Mojave Desert outside her window and an endless desk of files. At times, Claire wondered if fate had written it this way, to leave her a shadow inside the base, to let the past stay buried. But other times, she felt a pulse deep in the desert sand, as if the Mojave itself waited for the day it would wake, demanding she remember her old role. One late afternoon, while sorting through an archive box, Claire found a torn folder with a scrap of paper tucked inside. It wasn't an official document, but a fragment of an old map, ink blurred yet still bearing the words, "Desert Warfare Training." Her hand froze. A faint smile curved her lips, a mixture of bitterness and irony. She knew she might be dismissed as nothing more than a librarian. But war, once etched into a person, never disappears with a discharge stamp. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. The roar of Humvee engines tore through the Mojave afternoon. 20 vehicles lined up in a column, tires grinding the golden sand, kicking up clouds of dust that rose like smoke. Overhead, the sun blazed like a disk of fire, its glare bouncing off windshields, forcing young soldiers to squint. The high-level exercise began an operation designed to test their response to simulated GPS and radio interference. Inside the command room, digital screens glowed green-blue, showing the convoy's progress as dots moving steadily across the grid. Young officers crowded around the console, chatting with the casual excitement of those who thought this was just another drill, a war game staged in a barren desert. But then, the sky changed. A sharp wind screamed through the canyons, carrying sand as sharp as knives. Within minutes, the clear blue overhead was swallowed by a thick wall of gold dust. Visibility collapsed to only a few feet. On the monitors, the dots flickered, then vanished all at once. GPS went dark. The radio emitted a grinding static, a guttural growl like the breath of some enormous beast. Inside the Humvees, panic set in. Headlights slashed across swirling grains of sand that whipped like machine gun fire. The lead vehicle swerved, nearly colliding with a towering dune. Drivers shouted into their radios, but all they heard was the howl of the wind. The convoy broke formation, several trucks spinning aimlessly in the haze, stripped of all direction. In the command room, the air grew tight, stretched thin like a drawn bowstring. A young officer dropped his coffee cup, liquid spread across the console like a bloodstain. The screens stared back, black and empty. Someone stammered, voice trembling. "If they keep going straight, they'll drive into the canyon." No one answered. Faces stiffened, glances darted back and forth, searching for a solution that wasn't there. This storm hadn't been written into the scenario. This was no longer simulation, this was a real crisis. In the corner, a figure sat in silence. Claire Donovan, the woman the entire base dismissed as the librarian, remained still, her gray eyes following the chaos through the fogged glass. The wind shrieked through the cracks, sending loose papers flying across the desks. Claire closed her eyes briefly, breathing slowly, as if she were listening for the desert's heartbeat. On the wall opposite hung a plain frame, Inside was the scorched battlefield map, a relic from Baghdad. Its edges blackened, a few lines of ink still stubbornly visible. In that instant of chaos, Claire rose. No sound, no command. Her calloused hand pressed against the glass, against the burned scars of the paper. Miller, a young officer who had once mocked her, found his gaze locked on the gesture. He saw her eyes change. No longer the eyes of a desk clerk, but the steady fire of someone who had once led comrades through the smoke and ruin of Fallujah. The fire of someone who knew how to find direction when everything else collapsed. No one spoke, but the entire room shifted into the same rhythm. The howling wind outside, the static of the radios, the anxious breathing all faded back. Only the image of the middle-aged woman with her hand on the burned map remained, as though she was preparing to step out from the shadow she had lived in for 15 years. A young officer whispered, his voice catching in his throat. She knows the way. Every eye turned to Claire. A strange silence filled the room. No laughter now, no doubt. Only the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Could an old relic, a memory pulled from a war long past, be the key to saving them from the Mojave storm? A dry thunderclap cracked outside the glass window, nothing more than the wind slamming against the steel wall. The entire command room shuddered, desert dust seeping through the cracks, mixing with the heavy breaths of the young officers. On the control table, the screens remained pitch black, the signal lines completely dead. No one knew what to do. And then, Claire stepped forward. She didn't rush, but every step carved out a pocket of stillness inside the chaos. The scrape of her worn combat boots against the floor was barely audible, yet enough to draw every gaze toward her. No one had to call her. She had already become the center of gravity. In the smoke-dusted room bathed in sickly yellow light, a woman in her 40s, silver threading through her brown hair, suddenly carried the presence of someone who had once led men out of death's narrow alleyways. Claire placed her hand on the command table. The young officers instinctively made space, as if their own instincts insisted that this was the voice they had to hear. Her words cut through the thick, choking air. Not loud, not fast, but deep and unyielding. Get the paper map. Forget the GPS. Tonight it's only sand and the stars. One officer jolted, yanking open a drawer and pulling out a map printed years ago. The paper had yellowed, its edges torn, but Claire spread it flat as though unveiling an heirloom. Her finger moved swiftly over ridges and crude lines, pausing, then tapping firmly on a small point. They're off by 15 degrees. If they don't stop now, they'll drop into the canyon. The room froze. A young officer blurted out almost unconsciously. How do you even know that? Claire didn't answer. Instead, she turned and pointed through the window. The sky was pitch black, yet faint above it all still shone. Orion, 3 stars in a perfect row, clinging stubbornly against the sandstorm. Guide them by Orion, she said, her voice steady. Hold 30 kilometers an hour. If they do that, they'll be clear of the storm by dawn. Silence pressed down. No one moved. These were officers raised on screens and satellites, now staring at the reality of placing an entire convoy into the hands of a desk-bound veteran. Sweat streaked their temples, mixing with desert grit. But Claire didn't need their faith, not immediately. She bent low, pulled the radio microphone close, her eyes narrowing with the same focus she once carried behind a rifle scope. Her hands trembled faintly with age, but the voice that came out was steel. Lead vehicle, halt, adjust 15 degrees northeast. Identify Orion overhead. Maintain tight formation. Static filled the speakers, layered with the moan of the wind. Then a young, weary voice broke through, frayed and thin. Nothing but sand out here. Claire closed her eyes, summoning the map inside her head. She remembered every dune, every low ridge of the Mojave landscape she had walked countless times since her discharge, committing them to memory like scripture. Her voice dropped, slower, firmer, each word carrying weight. Look for 3 stars, lined in a row, just above the horizon. Orion never leaves, not even in a storm. Hold 30. No more, no less. The command room waited, every eye locked on the microphone as if expecting a miracle. Outside, the storm screamed, swallowing headlights whole. Inside Claire's mind, Baghdad surged back Fallujah, 3 days and nights with nothing but a scorched map and sheer instinct. Back then, she had stood at the front, carving life from chaos. Now the difference was only distance. She stood behind glass, guiding with nothing but her voice. One young officer whispered, his voice trembling, "Are we really putting everything in her hands?" No one answered, but silence was the answer. Claire opened her eyes. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through sand and fear alike. She knew exactly what waited out their lives depending on her, and she would not allow herself to fail. The radio screeched in bursts, harsh like metal clawing against steel. In the command room, no one dared breathe too loudly. Claire pressed the headset tight to her ear, her gray eyes flashing with razor-sharp focus. Amid the chaos of wind and sand, her voice cut through the comms, firm and decisive. "Lead vehicle, adjust 12 degrees down. Look to Orion. Do not break formation." Outside, the sandstorm roared like a colossal beast, devouring everything in its path. The headlights of 20 Humvees cast faint golden beams, slicing through the swirling grit. At first, the convoy staggered, weaving like a school of disoriented fish, beams of light scattered and swaying. But slowly, steadily, under the cadence of commands relayed from the command room, those lights began to gather into a single straight line, pushing forward together. Inside, every heart clenched with each order given. The young officers who had always dismissed Claire as the old librarian now stood pressed to the sides, eyes fixed on her lean frame. Miller, the one who had mocked her most, remained silent. For the first time, he saw clearly. This woman was driving the entire convoy, not with a steering wheel, but with memory and a scorched map. Claire leaned over the table, her fingers digging into the frayed paper's edge. On the old map, the lines of dunes and canyons appeared like scars, scars that mirrored her own. Every command she gave wasn't improvisation, but a shard of memory from Fallujah, where she had once chosen between life and death with nothing more than a penciled line. A burst of static crackled in her headset. Vehicle 7, 0 visibility, wheels slipping. The young driver's voice trembled. Claire shut her eyes, picturing the terrain. She knew this stretch of Mojave well, a patch of soft sand that often turned treacherous when the winds shifted. Without hesitation, she issued the order. Vehicle 7, ease off the throttle, stay silent. All other vehicles, surround, maintain 10 meters. Outside, headlights shifted. The convoy slowed, forming a protective ring. In the command room, everyone held their breath. Then the driver's voice returned. Cleared it. A collective sigh of relief swept through, but Claire did not smile. Fallujah had taught her. Celebrating too soon was the second blade. She bent over the map again, eyes scanning quickly, voice steady. Adjust another 8 degrees northeast. Orion will guide you out of the storm. Miller stood close, watching each movement. He realized there was a strange beauty in the way Claire commanded. No shouting, no displays of authority. Just steady certainty like the heartbeat of a steady drum. He saw in her what no technology could replace. The instinct of someone who had already walked through hell. Outside, the wind howled fiercer. Towers of sand rose like gray walls, swallowing everything. A young officer whispered, trembling, "They can't hold out much longer." Claire didn't turn, only murmured softly like a vow. Never believe sand decides. Willpower decides. In that instant, Fallujah flooded back. She remembered the screams of comrades, remembered the eyes that dimmed in the night. Her hand trembled, but her voice never faltered. Every order tonight was her way of repaying those who hadn't walked out with her. The convoy pressed on, each wheel biting deep into the soft sand, dragging out a thunderous growl. Each Humvee was no longer just a machine, but a life tethered to Claire's voice. And in the command room, stunned eyes slowly shifted into reverence. Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry, a thought searing through him. Without her, how many of those vehicles would already be fireballs in the desert? Claire never looked at anyone, her gaze locked on the map, her hand tracing Orion overhead. A thin smile flickered, bitter, yet proud. Perhaps fate had never intended for her to live quietly. The roar of Humvee engines faded, swallowed by the storm behind them. The Mojave night returned to a terrifying stillness. In the command room, everyone stood frozen, as if unable to believe what had just happened. 3 of the most harrowing hours of their lives had passed, and the convoy of 20 vehicles had made it through the sandstorm's edge without losing a single soul. Suddenly, GPS signals flared across the screens. Tiny green dots blinked back to life, linking into a line, a miracle in the darkness. For a moment, the room erupted. Cheers thundered, chairs scraped and toppled. Young officers grabbed each other in relief, laughing like they had just won a ball game rather than escaped death in the desert. But at the center, Claire quietly folded the map. Her fingers traced the charred black corner of the paper, as if brushing an old wound. She bowed her head and whispered so softly only she could hear. This time, no one was left behind. No one noticed except Miller. He stood close, watching in silence. The sneer he once wore was gone. In its place was deep respect, mixed with shame for the days he had mocked her. In that moment, Miller saw clearly. This woman had carried an entire convoy out of the storm, the same way she had once led comrades out of Fallujah. Claire slipped the old compass into her pocket and drew in a long breath. For her, victory wasn't in the cheers. It was in the silence of the names who had fallen long ago, as if tonight they could finally rest. The door burst open. The commanding officer entered, his face stern, though his eyes gleamed with rare relief. He raised a hand, and the room fell silent at once. Laughter stopped, leaving only the heavy breaths of men who had survived 3 hours of fear. "Donovan," his voice rang, heavy but resolute. "The Army was wrong to bury your skills under paperwork and warehouses. Tonight proved one thing: those skills cannot be wasted." All eyes turned to Claire. She remained seated, her hand resting on the map. The light reflected off its scorched edges, as though etching scars into the room, scars not beautiful, not perfect, but undeniably real. The commander went on, "We want you in the SEER program: survival, evasion, resistance, escape." Each word fell like a summons, but also like a door opening. The room went still. The young soldiers who hours ago had laughed at her now looked at Claire as if she were a living manual. Miller clenched his fists, his heartbeat pounding. He knew her decision would change not only her life, but theirs as well. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the compass in her hand. The needle trembled, then steadied, as if replying for her. In her mind, faces of the fallen in Iraq merged with the terrified yet unyielding eyes of the young drivers tonight. She heard Miller's sharp breath behind her, a reminder that a new generation still needed to learn survival that no technology could guarantee. The corner of her mouth curved in a dry soldier's smile. Who would have thought, from a disregarded clerk, she would return to teach others how to walk out of death's shadow? But this time, she wouldn't be the one leading into the trap. This time, she would teach them how to escape it. The commander watched her intently, waiting for confirmation. Claire raised her head, her gray eyes steady now, no longer hiding. She didn't say, "I agree." Her hand pressing firmly on the compass, holding it like a vow, was her answer. Outside, the Mojave wind still howled through steel fences, whipping sand like restless ghosts. But inside, Claire felt calmer than on any night since her discharge. Not because the GPS had come back, but because she had found her purpose again. Miller stepped forward, resting his hand on the table beside her. Not the rough slap of a soldier's camaraderie, but a hesitant gesture of respect. Claire gave a small nod, enough to dissolve the shadow that had stood between them. In Miller's mind, a chilling thought struck. If she hadn't been here tonight, how many of those vehicles would already be torches burning in the desert? The training whistle blared sharply, shattering the Mojave morning. Golden sand flared like fire under the blazing sun, the air dry as a furnace. Rows of recruits sat lined up, shirts drenched in sweat, breath coming in ragged bursts. In front of them, Claire Donovan stood tall. No longer in the faded shirt of the supply room, today she wore a simple, neat uniform. In her hand, the scorched map quivered in the wind, its edges blackened but unyielding. Those burn marks, once proof of a night of death, now caught the sun like a flag. She raised the map high. Her voice rang clear and steady, not forced, yet enough to silence the entire yard. When technology dies, what remains is skill, willpower, and sometimes just an old map. No one laughed, no mocking whispers. Only young eyes, tense and wide, swallowing every word. Faces still marked by cocky pride now confronted the truth. The desert doesn't care where you trained, it only recognizes the weak. Claire stepped closer to the front row, scanning each face. She recognized the unease hidden beneath bravado. It was the same look burned into her comrade's eyes that night in Baghdad when digital maps turned to ash and only a half-burned scrap of paper remained in her hand. She recounted it, without shouting, without drama. Just a steady voice, like water running over stone. They heard about the IED exploding, about 48 hours stumbling through smoke and fire, about how she pressed the map to her chest, using memory and faded ink to pull her team through the desert. 6 made it out, 3 never did. Miller, now an assistant instructor, stood at the side, arms folded, his eyes brimmed with respect. 3 months earlier he had mocked her. Now, he watched the recruits look at Claire as though she were a teacher they dared not interrupt. A faint laugh escaped him, a self-mocking kind. Some mistakes, he thought, you pay for all your life. Claire gestured. A young recruit stepped forward and took the map from her hand. The paper trembled, ink smudged, lines incomplete. He turned it clumsily, lost in confusion. Claire didn't scold. She didn't smile, she simply pointed upward. Orion, she said softly. 3 stars aligned, gleaming in the pale sky. Put your back to the southwest, follow them. Now, turn the map to match. The recruits tilted their heads. Some nodded, others frowned. But when the young soldier adjusted the map, his face lit up, as if he had just found a way out of the dark. Claire didn't let them stop at theory. She blew the whistle, leading the group onto a training field designed like a maze. Sand pits, man-made gullies, tarps stretched into pitch-black corridors. No GPS, no radios, only the scorched map and the stars. Scenario: all electronics disabled. You have 1 hour to get out of the maze. If you fail, the entire team fails. Murmurs of worry rippled through the group. But Claire stood firm, arms folded, eyes sharp as steel. In that instant they saw not a gentle instructor but a SEAL who had walked through hell. The exercise began. Boots sank into sand. Shouts of argument over direction broke out. Some rushed ahead, splintering the team. Others spun in panic. Claire noted every move. Who listened? Who gambled? Who left comrades behind? Occasionally she signaled Miller to blow the whistle. Hold formation. Don't split. Sweat streamed. The clock ticked down. With 10 minutes left, a group nearly ran into a dead-end ravine. Claire raised her hand, stopping them. She pointed to Orion, shining above. The sky never lies. They corrected their course. And finally, as the clock struck the last second, the recruits staggered out of the maze. Cheers mingled with gasping breaths. Some collapsed into the sand, exhausted but with eyes alight. Claire walked forward, her voice calm but heavy with weight. You've just learned what no soldier can ever afford to forget. Never underestimate a simple tool or the people you think are insignificant. Her words fell into silence, a silence heavy with understanding. A few young faces flushed red, realizing that the charred map was not just paper but life itself in their hands. When the training ended, Claire remained alone. The afternoon sun slanted, light pouring over the scorched map, making it glow gold like testimony. Once a scar, now a symbol. No one would call her a clerk again. Now she was a teacher, a bridge between blood-stained lessons and a generation that had never known fear. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.